So welcome back to this scene analysis where we're looking at James Cameron's 1986 film Aliens, and having previously looked at some of the scenes, I decided to make this really the final video in the series where we're going to have to cover a bit more ground, but it should nonetheless be interesting. We'll, for instance, look at, starting off with Burke's betrayal. There's the trap scenario with Ellen, Ripley, and Newt in terms of the facehugger, where Burke hopes to impregnate them, as well as the upcoming turret scene, which is a very exhilarating action sequence, and does have some significance in terms of the narration of the film. And furthermore, I'd like to study up more on the character portrayal of the Bishop, who, alongside Ripley, I really feel is the most interesting character in the film. And, there's some nice symmetry as well with the first film, isn't there? Because Ash was also very interesting in the first film, and now we have a new synthetic, which is equally interesting in my opinion. And finally, ending off, we'll have the encounter with the Queen Xenomorph, again a very nice addition by the director of Cameron to include this biological entity into the Xenomorph universe. But before we get into all these scenes, I'd like to give some a nice summary, or a refresher, I guess you could call it, in terms of the themes we have looked at, some arguments, as well as the symbolism discussed. And I'll also leave a timestamp in the comments section if you want to skip this section. But it should be worthwhile, I think, because it's nice to get a refresher in terms of all the material we have really covered in these analysis videos. So let's dive into that, shall we? We began by making a comment on the follow-up in this film of immersive, big budgetary landscapes, which tonally places the film right alongside the first film in the entry. This is important as it guarantees the same world construction as where we left off in the previous film, which furthermore seeks to sell the opening shots of the escape shuttle moving closely towards us in the same slow, deliberate pacing which plagued the first film. So then it is not just the visual tapestry which is presented in a familiar continuation, as well as developing its own set production additions, but we also witness the same slow dilation of time which for the unbeknownst viewer could be taken to place the film within the same horror vein as we previously witnessed in the first entry. One could also argue here that the ambiguity of genre establishment in the first third of the film makes the transition into the action format both novel as well as more powerful for the viewer in general. Lastly, let's not also forget that the sense of visual immersion here secures familiarity for the character of Ripley herself, who in turn finds commonality with the surroundings of the film, a symmetry which is immediately broken off in sequel films such as Alien Resurrection, to name an example. As another remark, one may make a comment here upon the ever-willingness to place Homo sapiens in the hands of technology, as for instance seen on board the escape shuttle, where the very basic life support systems is both facilitated and controlled by the ship's technological control interface systems. So, while Ripley has very feelings regarding the transference of power to the advanced cybernetic machinery, taking its most advanced form in many ways in the guise of synthetics, she has no authority in this new timeline of exerting her power in order to question this relationship. Nor is she afforded the opportunity, as she is naturally preoccupied with the ongoing establishment of a colony on the exomoon of LV-426, or the fate of her daughter in relation to the time-lapse which has occurred while being in stasis. It does not help that she maintains the official status of a civilian consultant, being brought along for the mission at hand, where she previously occupied herself as an automatic loading machine worker, the future's equivalent of a forklift driver, which relates the existing class divisions, which is in full swing in the future as well. And while the film ends with a positive note in regards to this entry's synthetic in the form of Bishop, I claim that it is not so much the indispensability of technology, which is questioned by Ripley, but rather the assumption of technology to clinically control the inhospitable surroundings of space comprising all its planets, moons, and proximity of alien life forms. The hubris of Father Science is further reflected in the naming of the escape vessel itself, which makes its entry in the beginning of the film. It is here aptly named Narcissus, which is in direct reference to a story from Greek mythology pertaining to a young man of the same name who became obsessed with his own self-image, where the modern equivalent of narcissism derives its origins. Stemming from Ripley's reluctance in getting herself involved with the mission, we witness a major theme of post-traumatic stress playing itself out during the film's running time. Having been in both such close proximity with the xenomorphs, as well as from the vantage point of Ripley having only recently been awakened, the stress event is still a recent one for her. Couple this with the fact that her daughter has already lived her entire full-grown life without her and is now dead as a consequence of Ripley's disappearance, one can certainly emphasize with her in terms of reluctance and a general feeling of distress. A major character development arc of the film is then set in terms of Ripley processing her own PTSD and eventually embodying the same sense of confidence, competence, resilience, and strength that we as audience members are so used to from the conclusion of the first film. One might relate this in terms of narration to an extreme variant of gradual exposure, where in order to overcome phobias, Ripley goes up against not just one but several reptilian goddesses taking the form of xenomorphs. However, while in the process she not only has to console Newt, who can herself be seen from struggling to cope with the horrors of past experience, but she also has to navigate new tactical challenges and displaying leadership qualities as things go haywire on the surface of the exomoon in regards to the mission unfolding. In some sense then, the mission, no matter how terrible it seems at the surface level, does much in fact to restore both Ripley's confidence as well as processing her own latent fears. This brings us to the second major differing aspect in comparison with the first film, where what is placed much more emphasis on in this film is the sort of social cohesion comprising a unified military team, as well as placing more weight on the role of autonomy versus leadership. What is explored then is the role of fraternity within military rank, where emotional bonds, mutual support, and camaraderie are important concepts for the proper functioning of any unit. There is a sense of duality between fraternity in day-to-day life, where people harbor different commands of coordination and support abilities, much like in a military setting where there exists a hierarchical organizational structure where both support and coordination are displaced even more rigidly in terms of hierarchical organization along military ranks. Note also the uniform homogeneous identity placed within military confines, which takes the form of hypermasculinity, where characters such as Private Vasquez have actively suppressed more stereotypified female traits in order to better establish what are seen as positively valued traits, such as conformity, strength, and assertiveness, a role which she inhabits so successfully, I might add, that other masculine characters in the troupe fade in comparison as she enacts her Rambo-esque features throughout the film. Getting back to the topic of leadership, the troupe certainly involves characters who display the right placement of competence when placed in new dangerous situations, such as that seen by Corporal Hicks, Sergeant Apone, Bishop, and Ripley herself, to name some key examples. On the other side of the spectrum, the complete shutdown of leadership abilities are displayed by the inexperienced character of Lieutenant Gorman, who, although bears a higher rank, is never able to adapt to the real situation unfolding, as well as not being able to command respect from his troops, nor the civilians partaking in the mission. What we see from him is rather an insistence upon following theoretical protocols, with a heavy influence stemming from simulations, which in totality seem rather incongruent when encountering the raw havoc of evolutionary breed destruction, which in the form of the reptilian goddesses we come to encounter. Thus, there is a theme of leadership explored in terms of organizational behavior, where both for the characters involved in the film, as well as the audience members partaking in the viewing process, there is a great deal of knowledge pertaining to observational learning in terms of the possession of leadership ability. The movie therefore functions in terms of narrative development to show the continual growth of both social power as well as leadership in terms of Ripley, while at the opposite side of the spectrum we see a decrease in the same qualities regarding both Gorman and Burke. Is not Ripley then the emergent leader in the film, who must once again act as the mythical dragon slayer in conjunction with harboring maternal instincts, as she fights for the protection of her, in a sense, child by proxy, comprising that of Newt? A final theme I would like to touch upon, before getting into the scene analysis portion, is that of the life of the xenomorphs creatures as further discussion into the field of bioethics. For if we grant that the creatures are in possession of moral status, stemming from their observed sentience, qualia, and cognitive potential, what obligations will it have upon us as human beings? Clearly, for the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, there is not just the negligence at play in terms of not affording moral status to the creatures themselves, but what I claim here is that it goes far beyond merely intervention, as the company is willing to remove the creatures from their own habitat with disregard for the species' own survival on the surface of LV-426 in order to pursue experimentation, where at any juncture, if there is an interest in the creature's survival, it must be tied to the profit-seeking motivations of the company itself. A morally abhorrent position which even Ripley comments upon as she asks the question of which is worst, human beings or the creatures themselves. It can be easy to sympathize with the colony marines, fighting off xenomorphs for their own survival, having not brought the xenomorphs' invasion upon themselves had it not been for the greed of Burke, and we might furthermore place the Marines as being viewed as an extensional arm of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, where along the maxims following from their own manipulation of science as a corporation, when given a hammer, all the world around oneself looks like a nail. I won't go into any long discussion regarding the ethics of extraterrestrial life here, but I would lean in favor, given similar conditions in the film, of a non-interventionist approach as to the creatures, where I would argue for some sort of universal framework regarding basic ethical obligations. The argument could be mirrored around other deadly creatures inhabiting Earth, such as leopards, where human casualties are most frequently tied with that of ever-increasing expansions and exploitations of nature, where I would not opt for eradication of the species in question based upon threat-level considerations in regards to humans. Rather, the ecological expansion, along with other environmental degradations such as pollution, are a reflection of our own moral progress as human beings, where one should strive for accountability in terms of conservation of sentient life, where in the case of xenomorphs the creatures should be afforded moral status with very basic ethical obligations such as being treated as an end in themselves. These minimal ethical obligations would further entail that I would oppose any sort of naturalistic ethics that is solely based around Homo sapiens' lives, or alternatively any contractual argument made along the lines of extraterrestrials not wanting or being capable of entering into any sort of contractual agreement among rational agents, where it would follow that rights would not be extended. Getting into the analysis of the rest of the film, we here begin where we left off with the confrontation scene between Ripley and Burke. This marks the point in the film where Burke's moral character is really torn to shreds, as it is revealed that he not only orchestrated the exploration of the derelict, but it also reveals his callous reaction to the massacre of 159 colonists of Hadley's Hope Colony, as his response to the event seems to be peppered with simple platitudes, such as remarking that it really was unfortunate that things really went out of control, and that he made a quote-unquote bad call. While we will witness as the film progresses how unadaptive Burke really is to the events unfolding, which seems more and more out of his reach of manipulation, but it would be a mistake to view his character as that of being highly unsuccessful in terms of scheming and manipulation. He obviously presents himself as someone who you would think to yourself that, yeah, he seems convincing in the sense that he has received political training in order to appear convincing for the benefit of those he serves. This is blatantly apparent in his early interactions with Ripley, for instance, when he is attempting to recruit Ripley for the mission at hand, using all means available to him. He in many ways thus presents himself as someone used to concealing his own blatant opportunistic tendencies in order to construct a guise of sympathy coupled with making others believe in his intentions with what they perceive as admirable desires but are in fact nothing but artificial. In an upcoming scene we get the infamous turret or sentry gun unit scene playing itself out, where the scene serves as a nice symbolic contrast to the first Alien film, where we hear due to the existence of an abundance of xenomorphs, we see them engaging with the target in a very expendable fashion. Where the singular creature of the first film slithered its reptilian-like features through the air shafts in ninja-like fashion, the creatures are here seen in contrast as exerting a full social force. We may here invoke the word of eusociality, where for the xenomorphs there exists a division of labor between the reproductive and non-reproductive groups. That is, the groups assigned to the care of the queen, brood care and hive maintenance contrasted to what I perceive as a more tactical, expendable group, which I take to be the ones charging for the turrets. From the human perspective, this scene does much to restore some semblance of confidence, as the Marines are seen rejoicing in the deadly potential of the weapons, which we must remark does succeed in holding off the first wave of oncoming creatures to their whereabouts. It also lets them get a taste for what a successful implementation of a plan might look like in regards to the creatures, which must inspire the team for future tactical planning in order to remove themselves from the situation they currently find themselves in. From the creature's point of view, we note the underlying intelligence of the xenomorphs as they make the tactical decision to withdraw from the line of fire after a wave of onslaught stemming from the gun unit. This is certainly evidence in favor of the cognitive ability of the aliens, where we might further conjecture that there might be some communication coming from the queen herself, or at least from the hive, as to not lose too many of the creatures' lives in the engagement. Following the crash of the first remote dropship, we learn that it has triggered somewhat of a meltdown due to the damage exerted on the power plant cooling system. It is at this juncture that Bishop volunteers to travel to the colony transmitter, as he is, to quote, the only one qualified to remote pilot the other dropship. There is in existence a very much understated trait associated with Bishop in terms of not inhabiting the same brute arrogance typically associated with artificial life forms. Although he obviously takes great pride in his superhuman abilities, he does not boast endlessly about them. Rather, he feels ultimately lament for the human species as he is afforded such gifts of resources which humans will have to make do without. Nor has he developed a particularly strong socializing ability, as we witness for instance in the scene where he tells Hudson firmly to trust him as he performs the knife trick, without offering any other reassuring guidance. We might also argue here that where he fails in sociality with the other Marines is not only related to the fact that he is a synthetic, but that he inhabits a pacifist philosophy within the confines of military work. It may therefore be that he is often misconstrued in terms of his inherent innocence when placed in such combative environments. Although I would claim that this innocence only extends so far, as his underlying modus operandi lies in the domain of logical assessments and in making other practical computations. I would, for instance, conjecture that if there were to pop up situations which from his calculations were deemed hopeless in terms of both escaping as well as securing all survivors, he would happily choose to select the amount of survivors which maximizes the survivability of the mission at hand. Although, as he remarks to Ripley, that it is impossible for me to harm, or by omission of action allowed to be harmed, a human being. I feel that the correct interpretation of the end sequence, in which he agrees with Ripley to fly into the atmosphere processor, is due to the fact that he has calculated the chances of survival of doing this as probabilistically viable, as opposed to being specifically prone to the rescue of human beings at all costs. There is also something very becoming in terms of his vocation as a mere technician, which is a very nice coupling with his introverted, lamentful personality. It is as if to make a symbolic statement that he enjoys working in the background until a particularly exceptional situation arises, where he quickly calculates that he cannot rely on the competence of those around him for more demanding specialized tasks, and must take a more active role within the social dynamic. He does not therefore aspire for the limelight of elevated intelligence and authoritarian tendencies by making collective decisions for a group, as we witnessed from Ash in the first film. Rather, we should believe Bishop as performing according to a pacifistic innate programming, where there is not just a perceived semblance of non-harm interference, but a reality of not directly engaging in harm in any active way. Unfortunately, life is much more complicated, such as involving indirect violence and other forms of structural violence, which means that as much as Bishop is driven by Asimov's laws, he will not shy away from making consequentialist calculations of ensuring rescue under conditions of probabilistic success, and not otherwise. This is another reason, perhaps, that he is so willing to volunteer himself for the mission at hand, as he has correctly evaluated his own superiority of survival as compared with the other team members. We might also easily assume that if there did arise a situation in which a team member was infected while stranded on a planet, Bishop would not hesitate in turning down the rescue mission if he did not believe the ship was adequately equipped with isolation and quarantine measures as to making the potentiality of a rogue chestburster entering the ship's air vents a minimal probability event in terms of risk. The next scene we detail here is the upcoming scene of Ripley and Newt as they are trapped in the medical laboratory with two conspicuously placed facehuggers, which is revealed to be all but a ploy in Burke's fated arc of morality, where he wishes to impregnate both parties in order to smuggle a sample past Earth's quarantine measures. Upon reflection, I wonder here what sort of alternate plan Burke would have come up with if Ripley did not threaten to expose Burke during an eventual escape. Would he have been callous enough to impregnate Newt, for instance, where the assumption would be that Ripley would somehow not get suspicious following the fact that Newt was left alone with a facehugger? In this case, the plan that we see executed in the film seems less risky, as he at least will have eliminated the threat of the one person who has exposed his true intentions through learning of the fact that it was Burke who sent a colony team looking for the derelict to begin with. The scene also touches upon a heavy theme in the first Alien film, where we see the reproduction cycle involving the facehuggers taking on a highly sexualized character, where, like we see with the inner mouth of the xenomorphs having a clearly phallic character, the facehuggers themselves are composed of an underside resembling that of a female vagina, with an extended probiosis used for delivering a xenomorph embryo. Let's not forget that the egg chambers themselves, which store the facehuggers, also have a vagina-like opening at the top of the egg, a very intentional feature from the artwork comprising that of the Swiss artist Giger. Is it too much to posit then that the character of Burke is in fact playing out his own rape scenario by proxy by using the facehuggers as a method of subjugation and dominance over his victims in order to restore the power dynamic over Ripley, which shifted as soon as she learned about his nefarious ulterior motives earlier. In this sense, rape would not connect primarily to sexual desire, but rather have a causal connection to that of power, domination, and assertion. Burke sees that his modus operandi has been exposed, and with that his whole character composition, which means that he now seeks to control what he views as victims in the guise of Ripley, where Newt fills in as an innocent bystander in the process. We encounter a final betrayal of Burke shortly thereafter, as he refuses to open the door for Ripley in an upcoming scene, as the creatures are making their entrance through the air vents. It's clear at this point that he is operating from a sense of desperation, having had his plans once again been upset by Ripley through her escape. Being a fish out of water from his usual corporate surroundings, he easily becomes meat for the xenomorphs as the situation escalates, and where he has in the final moments of his life lost all prior trustworthiness. We see some dignity being restored to the character of Lieutenant Gorman, as we see him rushing back to the aid of Private Vasquez, who is herself injured following an encounter with a xenomorph in the air vents. This can thus be seen as a completion of the side character arc of Gorman, as he gets to display some restored courage in his end scene with Private Vasquez. This scene then remedies his faulty courage from an earlier point in the film in many ways. On the other side of things, Newt gets herself captured by a creature as Newt, Ripley, and Hicks make for their escape. This sets up in turn the climactic ending action scenes where Ripley is seen to once again be inhabiting the role of the female dragon slayer. Only this time around there is an increased emphasis on the role of motherhood, stemming from the fact that Ripley's own child died when she was kept in stasis, thus frozen from action as it were. Not wishing to remain actionless while making for an escape, she chooses the sacrificial role of the returning hero as they make their way to the processing station hive. We may remark here that, much like Ripley herself, Newt has also lost everything of value to her in many ways, stemming from the destruction of the inhabitants of Hadley's Hope colony. Thus, there exists a protective, lingering element to Ripley's actions, as she wishes to protect the child from predators, as well as wishing to establish conditions prone to childhood innocence for Newt's future. Not also here, the contrast here in terms of the xenomorphs, where according to eusociality, the majority of the creatures have given up their reproductive potential in order to better enhance the survival and reproductive success of related individuals. This is further tied in with an evolutionary advantage in terms of having a clear fixed division of labor, where for the creatures it is seen as perfectly reasonable for the hive to be sacrificed if it means the continual survival of the queen and in extension new reproductive potential. It is therefore not surprising that the queen xenomorph leaves her kind away in order to survive aboard the Sulaco. There thus exists a nice duality here in terms of Ripley sacrificing everything in order to retrieve one of her own, while at the same time the queen prioritizes a fast escape, not risking the havoc and destruction aboard the exomoon's surface. The two adaptations of biological behavior are ultimately put up against one another as we witness Ripley fighting off the Queen Xenomorph in the final action scenes, where the female Dragon Slayer once again becomes the victor. We may draw comparisons here, for instance, to Hindu mythology with that of the demon Kaliya, a monstrous venomous serpent who is ultimately defeated by Lord Krishna. Krishna here represents, like Ripley, a protector of the innocent, where we also make note of the fact that the serpent Kalija inhabits a river, thereby reinforcing the image of aqueous surroundings, which we so often associate with the xenomorphs. As the river is often associated with purity in Hindu mythology, we can see the xenomorphs as either polluting the river, or more interestingly, as rivers are often personified deities, we can view the creatures as personified reptilian goddesses who should not be brought away from their operating habitat. whereby any such attempts of removal will ultimately end in a primal destruction in favor of the creatures. Alright, so that's really it for this video, and in fact this finishes up the whole Aliens film analysis series. In terms of the future, I'd like to do the Alien Resurrection movie at least, and probably some other entries and themes from the Alien franchise, as I quite enjoy it. But the next film series in the analysis series will be on 1999's The Matrix, directed by the Wachowski brothers, which should be interesting. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe, like, and comment, and until next time.